So I'm rather oddly going to talk to you about something that doesn't look like it's anything to do with forensic psychiatry, which is Kafka. You might have imagined, since I am in fact a forensic psychiatrist, that forensic psychiatry would feature at some point in the next half hour. It will a little bit, but not very much. So why is that? Well, because actually my journey to today began with literature. And indeed, as you'll see, it's sort of come full circle. And I'm rather grateful that in a medical school I can give a talk about books. Isn't that lovely and unexpected? So the trial, the castle and metamorphosis were all part of my early reading. And the shadow, this is rather peculiar, the shadow of a totalitarian oppressive regime fell over Leafy Surrey, which is where I was brought up. And that's an odd conjunction of things. And my parents, who are not here today, they provided, amongst other things, I think, the freedom to think. And that really is the opposite of Kafka's world. And that's an important observation, I think. So who was he? What did he write? Why does it actually matter for forensic practice that he did write things? Why does it matter for offender healthcare, which is now really my clinical specialty? So we can think about that over the next 25 minutes. This is Kafka. When I came across him at the age of, 14, 15, something like that, I had absolutely no idea that he was a giant of European literature. You don't really do when you're 14, because actually he's just another of the people who publishes in Penguin Modern Classics, and there's a whole lot of them that you can choose from, and I, for some reason, chose Kafka. In fact, he was born in the late 19th century. He died in 1924 of tuberculosis, so a short life, and he was Czech, and he was Jewish. And his life seemed really difficult. He had a lot of unhappy love affairs, and his books, they had a real connection, I think, with his rather tormented mental state. And he said, "The novel is me, and I am my stories." And I have to say, I think he was right. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, he's got a protagonist in both the trial and the castle, who's called Kay. The beetle is called Gregor. And oddly enough, that was my father's name. I shall leave that to Professor McGawley to interpret, I think. So these books are in fact less works of fiction, and they're much more insights into his mental state. And perhaps that's why they're allowed into this talk today. And what characterises them, rather sadly, this is 3 talks about some quite tough stuff, really. But fear and uncertainty actually characterise his writing. They also strangely anticipate what came after him. And the horrors of the Jewish Holocaust, and actually various incarnations of totalitarian states, be it Soviet, Nazi, Cambodian, they're linked with Kafka. So he seems very apt, as if you like, as a metaphor for the key historical events of the 20th century. And I had to remind myself, in fact, that this rather young man, he died actually only 7 years after the Russian Revolution. So he wasn't what I always thought he was, actually, which was a sort of Second World War writer. But what I read in adolescence, I have, at some level, remembered. And I suppose that kind of imaginative leap that I would guess all of you have made about things that were sort of central to your developing self in adolescence, that's kind of allowed me, I suppose, to be able to immerse myself in other people's lives, a different world, one very different from the one I lead. And that is a kind of necessary thing to do in forensic practice. It has truly informed my career. So in what way? Well, as I deal in turn with 3 of Kafka's great works, I'd hope to say that he speaks not only of his personal anguish, though how he articulates that is genuinely interesting, not only to an understanding of these great historical tragic events, but actually also to major themes, daily themes, if you like, in forensic practice. And these themes are very seldom covered in conventional textbooks. Not even this rather splendid one up here that Jim advertising in the Professor Royal Lecture. So Kafka's works resonates with forensic practice. How does it do that? Well, it does it in terms of obvious themes, but also in terms of tone and embedded less obvious themes. So what is he preoccupied with? Pretty grisly things, actually. So as I said, uncertainty, unpredictability, fear, incomprehension. And all of them are linked with incarceration. There are no laughs there, are there? But why is that important? Well, because they help us understand the mind of the forensic patient and the context in which he or she lives. So what does he do? He tells us about important connections between being socially excluded, being mad, and having to live in an institution. And these ideas are really useful springboards if, as I am, you find yourself responsible for clinical services in which people with and without major mental illness actually are locked up. Prisons actually don't contain that many people with major mental illness. They contain a lot of people who get upset about being in prison. So Kafka provides, if you like, an alternative take on what we do in offender healthcare, and one that should probably inform our discussion of the value, if any, and I say that as a deliberate challenge, about what we do. In being expressed through writing also tells us something really important, because some of the very simplistic approaches to care quality, and colleagues in the audience will know that I said something similar this morning in a meeting, these simplistic approaches to care quality we routinely and necessarily have to do can absolutely miss the point. They don't tell us what we need to know about what we do as clinicians. So I'm going to start with a story everybody knows. The beetle one, Metamorphosis. So Gregor Samsa is a young man who supports his family. He turns overnight into a beetle. His family, his parents, his sister are all completely horrified, as you would be. Think about it. You would be. So his sister, perhaps the kindest family member, leaves food out for him, and he gradually starves to death. As his life disintegrates, his father is then violent to him when he strays outside the bedroom in which he is effectively imprisoned, partly because he has difficulty getting through the door. So he's injured. And actually, there are some really grisly bits in Kafka. So an apple gets stuck in his carapace, and it festers. Nobody looks after him. He just kind of gets ignored. So we see a process of transformation, denigration, and disintegration, all good forensic stuff. But it's interesting because it's not only about his physical state as a beetle, but it's actually his loss of capacity to be understood. And also, he can't act effectively on the world because he's become a beetle in a bedroom. He's also lost his identity. So he's no longer this valued son and brother that was supporting the family, but actually he's an abomination to be hidden away from the lodgers. So he's a second-class being whose relatively innocent actions engender revulsion and fear in equal part. So you can see where I'm going with this, can't you? It's a very rich short story, conveying in only a few pages, really, lots of the themes that are relevant to the care of offenders, particularly violent ones, who have to deal with the response of people around them when they do things. Just to bring it back to real-life forensic practice, I wanted to tell you about something that happened to a colleague of mine. She newly arrived in a prison and found a prisoner who was in a very bad state, essentially languishing in a cell, and appeared to be slowly starving to death. And this person had been sent, in fact, out to a psychiatric hospital, had come back, and the care plan didn't really recognise that it was possible that this chap might starve to death. Now, Kafka writes about the difficulty of imagining people's inner worlds. Jill's actually spoken about people's real difficulties imagining inner worlds. And to be honest, I could only speculate as to what this particular chap could be thinking about. So he was excluded from the institutions of the mad, but also from the life of the prison. So he was in his cell, down a corridor, and no one was really taking any notice of him. And this is not great. He seemed unworthy of greater or more energetic intervention. I should reassure you, he got it. He didn't die. But that shouldn't be understood as a foregone conclusion. Because prisoners' health status is notoriously poor, almost invariably jolly complicated for most clinicians. And until very recently, they've had very little chance of getting the kind of health care that you guys and me absolutely take for granted. And prisoners and ex-prisoners are heavily stigmatized, really independent of what they've done. And of course, lots of them haven't done anything very terrible. And most of us are wary, positively unenthusiastic, and sensibly so, about any personal contact with the criminal justice system. So when the trial, Kafka's next book, takes us into forensic territory, we should, like Kay, the central character, be anxious. That's not a great place to go, is it? You wouldn't say that was welcoming. And indeed, the trial is a worrying book. Kay is arrested on page 1. And you feel that things can only go downhill after that. And his guards say, we don't know much about this criminal justice system. They can't answer his questions about the nature of his charge or the process to which he's going to be subject. It's his first time in contact with the system, and he needs help, poor LK. Now, of course, this is also true of lots of real people who get arrested for the first time. We have a system, as some of you will know, of appropriate adults in this country, designed to assist potentially vulnerable folk in contact with the criminal justice system, to support them through what can be a rather horrid time. And that system is creaking at the seams. In Holloway Prison, where I have been working with Jill until recently and where I worked for 10 years, it was a commonplace for women to have very little contact with lawyers. Many of them barely knew who was actually representing them in court. And those legal aid cuts that have resulted in this kind of situation have cut extremely deep. Women who couldn't read English had difficulty with paperwork. We had fantastic people, fabulous staff. Hibiscus was a voluntary sector organisation specifically to help foreign national prisoners, but people who couldn't communicate well in English. But despite that, people didn't know where they were. Some women were floridly mentally ill. Other women had learning difficulties, and both these conditions obviously impair people's capacity to follow what's happening in court, or even grasp actually what they're charged with. So the world, from the perspective of women in that situation, struggling with their criminal cases, must seem Kafka-esque, even if it's not. And indeed, to go back to the trial, Kay, like many real prisoners, does begin to struggle. When we meet him, he's actually a sort of competent administrator working in a large organisation that's sort of a bank, but not quite. And he gets weak, he gets stressed, and he can't focus at work. He takes on his own case because he doesn't trust his lawyer. I always think that's quite a bad sign, actually, generally speaking. He gets suspicious, he gets depressed. And actually, he's not incarcerated at this point. But actually, what happens to him and how he experiences this really links with what we know empirically, which is that going to court, being involved in court proceedings, and indeed getting legal decisions made about you is enormously stressful, to the point where a change in legal status in a prisoner is a recognised trigger for potential suicidality. Kay's experience of the world is called into question by he has an encounter with some guards. The guards who looked after him to start with. Kafka really doesn't make sense if you take it in a very concrete way. So his guards are now prisoners. They're lurking in a lumber room. And actually they're being whipped. So we're really in the land of the bizarre. The next day he goes to work and the same thing happens. So he finds the guards in the lumber room, they're still being whipped. This is very hard stuff for any reader to interpret. And actually, I think we're entering the territory of madness. So the balance of Kay's mind is increasingly disturbed. And we begin to wonder, as we read the book, whether he's hallucinating the whole thing. So he's looking at these grave proceedings that people keep telling him about. He also learns there's no point actually even defending himself because he's in front of a court that never acquits anyone. That's not really the case in Britain. So he continues to crumble. He goes to a church and he experiences the priest in the pulpit speaking directly to him about his case. The priest says the case is going very badly. Phenomenologists might be wondering what's going on. What is going on? What's happening to him? What phenomenological issue is emerging? He's listening to the priest in the pulpit. How many psychiatrists are there in the room? And none of them are going to answer. Hooray! Yes, ideas of reference. So that's what it looks like. So actually what Kafka's given us is a picture of someone becoming possibly psychotic in a novel. And to make it worse, Kafka's experience of the priest in this church is he gets screamed at, which I have to say, it's implausible, isn't it? That's not terribly likely. So Kafka's world is one that is paranoid, and his character K is suffering. And so the evidence is that K may not be well. Perhaps his perceptions aren't real in that ordinary sense of the word, but they are very real to him. And he's unhappy as a consequence. It's kind of striking in this book that at no point other than right at the beginning is K actually held against his will. Rather, he's frantic. He's searching for meaning. He's searching for certainty. So is this all a trick of his own mind? It's very reasonable to suggest that that's the case. But Kafka's own vision is bleaker. So what happens next is that two men come along to K, where he's lodging. He says, I'm not ill. But he goes with them in a rather sort of passive kind of way. And there's a very odd bit, very forensic and difficult to understand. And he says that he feels invited to kill himself, but doesn't do so. He mourns the fact his case has never got to court, and the nature of his charge remains completely unclear to him. And at that point, he's butchered by his two companions. The castle is positively cheery by comparison. I have to say, it's probably because it's an unfinished book. So, like the trial, what are we talking about? We're talking about hierarchy, we're talking about institutions, but we're not focused on madness as we were just now. Institutions are kind of complicated. More complicated, I suspect, than most of us think most of the time. They're bricks and mortar, aren't they? St. George's is bricks and mortar. But actually, what else are institutions? They're vehicles to impose social rules, which is perhaps a hard concept. So the castle is a building, but also, to our second K, Kafka's land agent, it's actually a controlling authority. And in fact, the description of the bricks and mortar, it has to be said, not completely unlike, any guesses? Prague Castle, exactly. He is Czech. So there is a bricks and mortar castle in the book. It's got turrets, and it's surrounded by more anonymous dwellings. And for West Londoners amongst you, and this is Wormwood Scrubbs Prison, surrounded also by other less exciting buildings, shall I say. But what does the castle have to teach us? Well, it has a lot to teach us about the predictability of life, the role of reason, ambiguity, but it's mainly about social control in institutional form. So that puts us very firmly in asylum and prison territory. And I'm sure in this audience, I absolutely don't need to say this, but we do know that psychiatry has been particularly good over quite a long period of time at building asylums and locking people up in them. And prisons in this country are not invariably, but they are usually closed institutions. There are one or two in East Anglia where you can sort of go walk about and farm a bit. But that is more typical. So what does the castle do? Well, it prepares the ground for us by giving us a Kafka-esque perspective on how best to understand institutional ideas and practice in real life, not just in fiction. Castles keep people in, but they also keep people out. Kay's castle keeps him out. Why is that? Well, he's the wrong sort of person. He's a stranger. Now, that's the golden rule of prisons, actually. Getting in to see anyone in prison as a relative or outside professional is notoriously difficult. Invariably, one has the wrong badge. Some of you will have heard all about this on the Archers recently. Pat has tried to visit the unfortunate Helen, who is that rare thing, potentially a violent female offender. Would she have gone to Holloway? Possibly. In fact, Kay in the castle encounters lots and lots of barriers in his quest to get anywhere near the person he really wants to see in the castle, who's a sort of mythically powerful bureaucrat. And what's worse, I suppose, about this particular institution is that the rules of the game in the castle are it's what happens underneath the surface of his various ghastly social encounters that really matter. People aren't quite what they seem. They don't do ordinary things. Kay has a couple of assistants, but actually they're sent to monitor him. And it's all very frightening. The town's inhabitants, similarly, are at the whim of the castle. So there's a poor old soul called Amelia, and she's rebuffed, a castle bureaucrat who is in fact a sexual predator. And what happens to her is a sad tale. Her family becomes social pariahs, the village sack her father from his job, boycott his shoe business, and they too struggle in this futile fashion with the impossible bureaucracy of the castle. So why am I telling you all about this? What's it all about really? Well, actually I'm saying it because what comes through in Kafka, every bit of Kafka really, is the insensitivity of institutions to the needs or wants of individuals. And the sheer difficulty in understanding why institutional practices are as they are. And even the assumption of logic in institutional practice appears a bit unwise. Now, we might all have done some things that bring us into contact with incomprehensible bureaucracy. I have recently attempted to buy council parking permits. I have tried to change a Ryanair ticket. And I've tried tackling the NHS pension scheme. Now, there's an important difference between me trying to sort some stuff out for me and the situation actually of Kay, which is that these things don't determine our entire lives. I'm sure we've all tried to buy parking permits. This is London after all. But I suppose that difference, the extent to which our lives are determined by institutional practice, is very different if we're us here today or if we're an incarcerated patient. So it's probably not a coincidence, after all this kind of early reading, quite depressing early reading, it has to be said, that I myself embarked on a career not only as a forensic psychiatrist, but also on a study of a secure institution. So my take on the hospital in question, more advertising, was as left field really as Kafka's. So I did it using techniques of social anthropology. And of course what anthropology is interested in is not individual clinical outcomes, not the sort of thing that clinicians amongst us really want to get right. But they're interested in the social world and the rules of the social world. So like Kafka, actually, I was really interested in daily life. And in particular, in a secure hospital setting, I wanted to know what power was. How was it used? How was power understood by all the people in a secure hospital? And rather like Kafka, I found confusion. In this case, confusion in the minds of the patients about how things could be influenced, how you could get stuff done. So their dominant experience was the exercise of power over mundane, but actually really important aspects of their lives. Patients were reliant on staff to do things for them. Now, this is quite odd, because actually in an acute hospital setting, that's kind of normal, isn't it? You're really ill, you're in a bed, might need a bedpan. This is a mental hospital, and the patients could physically and mentally have done most of those things for themselves, i.e. this mental disorder, the status of being a mentally disordered offender, didn't actually constitute an obstacle. But the rules of secure hospital life meant they weren't allowed to do these things. So they existed in a state of considerable dependency. Staff had the power to help them or not. So requests for doors to be opened, dental appointments, getting hold of cutlery, getting hold of towels, toothbrushes, making a phone call, all those required very careful negotiation. This is completely different from customer service for similar items in a hotel. And staff in this institution could, and sometimes were, too busy to help. So actually patients developed all sorts of careful strategies about working out who would help, when to approach them. And this was really critical to success in terms of getting their basic needs met. And staff, of course, who were too busy, or who in fact failed to deliver on promises, were really unpopular. In prison, of course, you see something quite similar, and there's an interesting term in the prison literature, which is organisational respect. And I think that's quite a good term. And these things are different from courtesy. Why is that? Well, because actually we're talking about hierarchical institutions. Courtesy is what we all use in our relationships, I hope, most of the time. But it doesn't imply that there's a relationship of hierarchy with the person we're talking to, though it might include that. So in this hierarchical system, one group, the patients, lack power and they lack agency. And actually this is quite interesting when we reflect on the Care Quality Commission, the main, if you like, hospital regulator, and indeed GP regulator and everything else regulator. We are in danger, I think, in the NHS, of suffering from death by regulation. But organisations have to be caring, they have to be safe, they have to be effective, they have to be well-led and responsive. And some of that is absolutely about patient-staff encounters. And in this particular institution I was looking at, these practical displays of power were overt, and you did either get the toothbrush or you didn't. And covert decision-making that lay behind some of this was much harder for patients to understand or to challenge. And patients would, and perhaps they were prone to do this anyway, but they would think of staff as quite secretive. Fundamentally, this was all much less significant to them than not knowing when they might leave. There was, at this point in this institution's history, tremendous uncertainty attached to how long they were likely to be in hospital. But they were in hospital for years. And even when people said, yes, you can go, we will use a discharge plan, that process was really complicated, and there were sometimes utterly inexplicable delays. So it's really quite hard not to be reminded of Kay's frustrated attempts to get into the castle to meet Clam, or if the other case wished to establish the likely pace of his grave proceedings. A couple of examples from this piece of work that perhaps bring these things further to life. Rooms and meals, very, very basic things. You can experience life on a hospital ward sort of inattentively. You can just be there and not think about what the rules are. But actually the day-to-day movement of people in space, people wandering around in a secure hospital ward, can tell you a great deal about power. So the way people can and can't occupy rooms and spaces tells you what kind of person they are. And this is very quickly learnt by patients because transgression gets punished. And once the rules are learnt, what happens? Well, if they experience these rules often enough, it informs, if you like, their sense of who they are and where they are in this hierarchical system. The allocation or withdrawal of bedrooms was a mystery. It was one of those bits of covert decision-making. Nobody knew how you got a bedroom. It's really quite an odd situation. But getting a bedroom was really important. But actually, once you got it, it was yours. It was this kind of little bedroomy thing. But it was an illusion of ownership because you could be locked out of it. And the privacy you got, and that was very valued, was only partial. In contrast, of course, staff always had access. They'd check to see if you died in the night. That's no bad thing. They could come into your room even if you didn't want them to do so. And if something went missing from the ward, a teaspoon perhaps, staff would keep you out of your room and search your private possessions. And actually protest was pointless, quite futile. Mealtimes, in a way, were equally revealing because what they offered beyond food was an opportunity for surveillance and supervision. So 3 public meals a day with checked tablecloths meant an opportunity to count patients as they ate. So they had to eat. So opting out of meals, not an option. Whereas, interestingly, in this really quite sterile environment, there were little tiny glimpses of agency where people would say, actually, I want to make a cup of coffee. It's my cup of coffee. I'm going to go to my locker. I'm going to make it. So the highly institutional patient meals, they're eaten in haste. There's no real conversation. They tell you it's not a domestic experience. Whereas private snacks are statements of agency. Mary Douglas, for whom I have huge admiration, an old-style social anthropologist who writes beautifully, she says if food is a code, the message it encodes will be found in the pattern of social relations being expressed. The message is about different degrees of hierarchy, inclusion, exclusion, boundaries and transactions across the boundaries. So why might any of these perspectives, a 20th century novelist and a psychiatrist masquerading perhaps as a social anthropologist, be of any value? Well, fundamentally because they flag understandings of institutions and institutional practice and madness that are real, but in our zeal in the current NHS to assess madness and institutions in different ways, they're usually absent. And we have a really good toolkit to check the state of health of both the NHS and indeed of our prisons, and many of you will be familiar with at least bits of it. And we use slightly different things when we think things are going well and when we think things have gone badly wrong. So what's in this toolkit? Well, there are monitor targets, commissioner targets, trust key performance indicators, audits and the occasional service evaluation, root cause analysis, friends and family tests, sequence targets, and periodic Her Majesty's Inspector of Prison reports and Care Quality Commission inspections, to name but a few. And those are a lot of tools. This is from the last ever HMIP inspection of Holloway. And I think the people who have been working in Holloway recently should be really proud of it, actually. It's one of those rare things. It's an inspectorate report that says good things about what's going on. And I'm very grateful to my colleagues in CNWL and other organisations for having got that as a kind of testament to their work. After I left, I should say, they got that. It's an interesting time for Holloway. But actually, routine quality measures from that long list that I've just given you are much more usually reduced to a convenient traffic light system. They don't have so many words, so they look a bit like that. That picture on the right, you get green and indeed one red traffic light. And there are amber ones as well. And this is about success or failure. So it's now considered that we can't manage without these measures in the health service. And I think IT has a lot to answer for, because you wouldn't get that with a quill pen. But we don't trust professionals anymore to do a good job. And in Marilyn Strathern's memorable phrase, we inhabit and embody an audit culture. We need to check constantly. And we really resist efforts to say, actually, to what extent is that distracting us from what we're supposed to be doing, which is looking after patients, having time with patients. So there's an inevitable kind of cost, if you like, to this checking. And these kinds of tools focus on what the institution, be it NHS or prison, actually say they're doing. So we are really not interested in Goffman's amazing insights into institutional practice. He says a number of things that are quite controversial. So he says boarding schools, mental hospitals, concentration camps are much the same. He looks under the surface of what's going on. And he says the same sets of rules, somewhat dehumanizing rules, are applied with different levels of zeal in ostensibly different organizations. So here's a school. At least two people in this audience will recognize it, apart from me. It was the one I went to. And whatever I think about this convent school, even I didn't think it was a prison. But then I wasn't actually a boarder. But I do agree with Goffman that looking under the surface of organizations and institutions is very wise. Why is that? Well, because the place of understanding in this very, very busy NHS world of quality monitoring is very far from clear. We spend much less time trying to understand things and much more time trying to move on to the next agenda item. So even where we have really compelling narrative that tells us a lot about the quality of care we deliver, we tend to rely on executive summaries and many, many, many sets of traffic lights. So let me talk about H-chips. Please think, when you look at this slide, about which bit of it is more appealing. This bit here, sadly, is the bit we ought to be thinking about. So what are H-chips? And there are one or two people, I think, in front of me who do know what they are. They've suffered under the H-chip regime. But they are the latest measures of prison healthcare. So why do they matter? Well, as I've already said, there's a lot of historical concern about the quality of healthcare offered to prisoners. 2006 saw the NHS take over commissioning of healthcare for prisoners. And lots of investment followed, really lots. And the prisoner patient was meant to get services no different from that of the general public. This was revolutionary. I cannot say how revolutionary it was. And it challenged the idea of the unworthy patient. And since then, we've tried to work out how well we're doing. And H-chips attempt to do that. Their intentions are admirable. The resulting data is not. And the DH has demanded that over 200 individual measures are reported each month by healthcare staff in each prison. Who could argue with that? Well, some of us have done. Partly because H-chips don't have much relationship to health status. And that matters because the NHS is there to prevent disease and to make people better when they're ill. So that's what we want to capture, actually. And H-chips don't do that very well. Secondly, H-chips weren't really welcomed on the ground because they were an awful lot more work. So this was a lost opportunity, if you like, to gain some real insight into the state of prison healthcare. It's now being rethought a bit, partly because our Prime Minister seems to be taking a remarkable interest in prisons. So as a happy accident of rethinking. Now, H-chips may be a really unfair example. It was rolled out nationally, it's cost a lot, and so far it's told us not much of note. And that is a real shame. But before you all get too worried, I'm really not suggesting we rely on Kafka to assess the quality of offender healthcare. Kafka asks different questions. Ethnography asks different questions from those that H-chips and their friends necessarily ask. But I am saying, let's think outside the box a bit. We need to pause to think about what questions about healthcare are vital, that really, really matter to patients, rather than relying on this huge amount of data that we happen in a computer age to be able to get hold of quite easily. So having at our fingertips different frames of reference can be a really useful way of achieving that. The insights of the humanities do not make for good traffic light systems, but they can help medicine stay humane. So Will Self said recently on the radio, everybody knows Kafka's stories, but they don't read them. So I hope I persuaded you that they're worth a shot, or at least a reread, if you've read them before. And I've also hoped that I've persuaded those of you particularly wedded to questionnaires and activity schedules that there's more to life and there's more to medicine than surface impressions of clinical care. So, would I have ended up working with offenders without Kafka? Probably not, actually. So I'm blaming him for the unlikely course of my career to date, but I thank him for healthy scepticism about our current approach to care quality in the health service. And I also very much look forward to encouraging the humanities agenda here at George's over the next few years. Not as an add-on, not as an extra thing, but actually as something that's integral to helping medical students and others get good at patient care. And the humanities aren't a substitute for scientific evidence-based medicine, but they help us dig deep as clinicians. And that digging deep increases rigour and encourages excellence. And finally, I want to say thank you to all these lovely people, my collaborators. That's a rather Kafkaesque word to finish on, collaborators. But really, thank you to all these people with whom I have written over the years and others with whom I've worked. Thank you very much.